So it gives me very great pleasure to introduce to you Brian Richardson and Christina Walter, who are our two main speakers for today as we celebrate Brian Richardson's most recent publication. Brian is a professor of English whose research interests in international modernism are reflected in 7 books, 12 collections of essays, and over 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. These deal with a range of topics, including modernist fiction, narrative theory, reader response theory, the theory of fictionality, the narrative of literary history, aesthetic value, feminist theory, and the poetics of modern America. Joining us to discuss this volume and ask all the hard questions is Christina, or the fun questions, all the questions, is Christina Walter, an associate professor here in the department who specializes in modernism and contemporary British and global Anglophone literature and visual culture. She's currently at work on her second monograph, Modernism from the Gut, Aesthetic Ontology and the Science of the Second Brain. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, and so here we go. And thank you all for being here.
Excellent. Thanks to everybody for being here in the middle of a busy day. I wanted to start our conversation off by actually reading from the blurb on the back of the book, in part because Brian and I both know Jesse Matz well. And when I saw that Jesse had blurbed the book, I was like, ooh, nice. So Jesse Matt says, this book's exciting discovery, The Critical Reader, cultivated by modernist fiction across a vast range of texts and authors, is a timely affirmation of modernism's cultural value, as well as a welcome reminder of the profound wisdom that has established Brian Richardson as our leading authority on modernism's narrative dynamics. Um, he didn't quite mention, of course, that in Europe, Brian is the father of unnatural narrative. Is that right?
Yeah, a natural
Oh,
narratology.
okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Um, okay. So I wondered if you could just kind of start us off by talking a bit about this concept of um, the critical reader. Like, what are its characteristics and what are its functions within modernism?
Sure. Yeah, the idea of the critical reader is something that emerges with Gustave Flaubert and is developed by a huge number of subsequent modernist authors. And the key thing about the critical reader is someone who is a skeptical reader, skeptical in particular of idealism, idealist notions, and romantic tropes or ideas. And so we see, obviously Emma Bovary is the primary figure there. And what's interesting is after he writes that, he goes on to do the sentimental education. And there the critique expands from romantic, ideas of love in particular set forth by romanticism to all kinds of ideas set forth in fictional and non-fictional works. So somebody like Conrad then takes it and really runs with it in a number of, at least 10 of his works. He figures failed readers who are insufficiently critical readers.
Excellent. You're already kind of starting to give us a sense of a kind of evolution of the concept of the critical reader. And so I wondered if, of course, different writers are going to do, different things with the concept, and I understand that, but I also see the book charting a kind of trajectory of the uses and fortunes of the skeptical reader sort of across the 20th and early 21st century. So do you want to say a little bit about um, sort of how the or sorry, how the critical reader or the skeptical reader changes, and maybe part and parcel of this, and this is kind of the way that I talked to you a little bit about it yesterday, was, we have this sort of chestnut, this Brian McHale chestnut, as it were, that modernism, has a kind of epistemological dominant, right? It's concerned with like questions of knowledge, like what can we know, and that postmodernism, it has an ontological dominant, is more concerned with um I don't know what what exists, and so forth. So one way of answering the question then would be to say, does this critical reader provide us a new lens for taking that journey, or do you kind of see the critical reader opening up some different facets? Yeah, what did you discover, I guess, as you were going through
Yeah,
this?
sure. So let me take that as two questions. So the first concerning the development of the critical reader, one of the amazing things is that there is a remarkable similarity over time, over several decades, and indeed over a century. Uh, and that's because romanticism and idealism are still widespread and still need to be contested. So, if you read Ian McEwan, Atonement, or for that matter, a couple of other more contemporary neo-modernist works, you see a lot of the same dynamics going on. So now, on the other hand, there's much less of it after the 1950s. And to some extent, you could argue that that's because it's done its work, and that we have many readers have become much more critical readers, and we know at least what that means. That the hermeneutics of suspicion has sort of penetrated a more expansive level, certainly since the 1960s, and so there is arguably less need for that. To take the other part of the question, so one of the interesting things that I discovered here is that what representations of readers of postmodern works, actually you can go back and find in Borges very similar notions of reading that are pre-postmodern, if you will, or anticipate the kinds of setups that postmodern authors would present. Uh, yeah, the near the end of his career, he has a wonderful work called The Book of Sand, and it is the perfect representation of indeterminate reader response notions, that nothing is fixed, that everything is constructed by the reader, and it's a book whose pages change every time it's picked up.
Mm-hmm. You in your answer, you sort of used this idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is very much part of recent conversations in our own moment, like critical theoretical conversations about ways of reading, the ethics of reading, particularly thinking about the difference between the suspicion that might anchor close reading practices, and the possible value of surface reading, and intermittently you engage with some of this discourse, since you're thinking about reading and misreading at the level of the characters, but also in some ways in the ways that the books are dealing with an implied reader. And so I wondered if you can sort of point to your engagement with that scholarship, and how you see yourself participating in that conversation, or giving it kind of new points of focus.
Thanks. Yes. Yeah, there's been a lot of work recently done on reading again. And again, you can see it as a kind of continuum, building off of some earlier concepts. And at this level, the disputes and debates over surface reading and reparative reading and comparable concepts are strike me as very helpful as one opening up new methods of reading that had been sort of either shut down or shunted off to the side. And the other thing is uh, one thing to know that these tend to be larger metacritical notions that have less direct application to the reading of a particular text. And they're more about interpretation in general rather than in reading a particular narrative. Um, so uh, on the one hand, these are wonderful because it really gives me an opportunity to dive in. And it also points out, I think, something that has been missing in the debates up to this point. And that is so many of these authors are staging misreadings uh, that are encouraging us to see through the actual readers to see through. And this is something that is rarely picked up on. Uh, so yeah, that would be what I feel as my contribution to that particular debate.
Excellent. Um, so one of the points that you just made about you use the formulation or interpretation in general, right? So not just readers, but or interpretation in general. And this was something that struck me as I was reading, that sometimes we are talking about reading and misreading at the level of a literary text, right? Like readers that are reading or want people to think that they're reading, but they're actually not
Yeah,
doing any reading,
yeah,
as is often the case. And at other times, reading is more metaphorical rather than literal, where it's used as like a synonym for something like analysis or interpretation. And in that case, reading, the objects that you're reading are um, sort of like actions in the world, right? Social kinds of issues. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how we get to those two levels. Is the critical reader, um, is there a kind of like didactic function where we're essentially being taught or encouraged to be good readers, critical readers, not just for the sake of being customers of modernism, as it were, but as a way of navigating the world. And I guess another way of asking that is kind of what role does the critical reader imagine for modernism, kind of in the world. I don't know if that sort of cluster of things makes you
oh,
sort of
absolutely. Oh, yeah, yeah. And this is something that I dealt with throughout writing the book. Originally, very long ago, when this project first began to emerge dimly in the recesses of my mind, I imagined it as a study of interpretation and acts of interpretation staged in modernist works, like The Dead, for example, or this Conrad's The Secret Sharer, uh, and going on from there. But then I realized, interpretation is, of course, everywhere all the time. So I had to narrow it back down. And so I focused on the effects of reading. Now, of course, the effects of reading are not limited to a text, and they always extend out to larger interpretive questions. And that's one of the things that got me so excited about this project. Um, just to give one example, for example, in Conrad, a very early text, An Outpost of Progress, you have uh, you see the exactly the movement here between them, where there are these two European figures who wind up in Africa running a trading post. And they come across these tattered copies of fiction by Dumas, Cooper, and Balzac. All these imaginary persons, Conrad writes, became subjects for gossip as if they had been living friends. They discounted their virtues, suspected their motives, decried their successes, were scandalized at their duplicity, or were doubtful about their courage. The accounts of crimes filled them with indignation, while tender or pathetic passages moved them deeply. And in the same paragraph, they are depicted reading imperial propaganda in an old newspaper. There, too, they have a naive and credulous response to the material. Their emotions are readily manipulated by the author, and they're entirely unable to read either text critically. So here you have a complete fusion of interpreting the world and interpreting the fictional narratives that they hold in their hands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So and I could just add as there were so many works that and so many authors that fit so nicely into this paradigm. That the more difficult one was Katherine Mansfield, who she does have a few scenes of reading that are very powerful and fit in nicely, but she's mostly interested in dramatizing dramas of misinterpretation, especially between classes. So I had to fudge a little bit and to get her in properly, but yeah, I think very much she's part of that project.
Mm-hmm.
So more on the interpretive side than on the actual reading side.
Right. Right. This might seem like a big shift, but in my head it builds from the kind of origin points that you talked about in your first response in Flaubert and a kind of skepticism about romanticism, and then in your last response, a a kind of possibility for being manipulated or led, right, by reading. And so I want to, this is a sort of way that I want to bring in the question of sexual desire, which I know is not the same as romanticism, but you're sort of, you bring up in a number of different chapters the way in which questions of reading and misreading are frequently tied to sexual desire. And I was wondering, in the context of your first response, well, does that take us back in some way, like as a response, a development on this kind of anti-romanticism? Is there something there? Is it something else? So I wondered if you could just talk a bit about what you see going, why is sexual desire connected variously with these accounts of reading or misreading? And maybe there are multiple whys, but since it comes up at a number of points, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and that still remains something of a mystery to me. I was doing all this work, and at one point I went to a conference, a Conrad conference, and I pulled out a number of examples of post-colonial responses to Conrad on the subject of reading and books, material books in particular. And as I put the paper together, I realized, oh, these are also all about sexuality. This is very interesting. And then I thought more, and I realized, my God, most of these also involve sex and reading. And now you don't find it in Conrad, and you find very little in Woolf, but most of the others you do. And in fact, Madox Ford is ubiquitous in The Good Soldier. So Now, why that would be the case? Well, there's some interesting ideas there that I could talk about. Uh, it goes back to it has been a literary trope for a long time, going back to Dante and the depiction of Paolo and Francesca and their reading of the story of Lancelot and Guinevere is the trigger for their uh, uh, adulterous union. So it's been around, and of course, if you want to demystify illusions, sexual desires are a really good place to start. You'll never run out of material there. Uh, so that clearly presents itself. And then finally, Valerie Rohi, a wonderful scholar, points out that especially for gay writers, um, and gay people in general, that their first encounters with people able to talk about their sexuality is not with family members or even friends, but often with books. And that's where they learn about same-sex desire. And again, and then just thinking back, you can, the history of literature is often tied up with the history of censorship, often for sexual reasons, depictions of sexuality, and as was the case in France, where Madame Bovary was prescribed at the beginning, and and Ulysses, of course, and we can give many other examples, and the Well of Loneliness.
Lady Chatterley's Lover.
Yes.
I want to ask just one. I have lots of questions, and
You
I
have
want to
great
ask just one more leading off of what you just said, and then open up the conversation for other folks to ask questions. And maybe I'll ask some more if there aren't other questions. But your response about sort of queer readers learning about queer ways of being in the world through literary texts, is of course invoking your argument that so often the readers, these critical readers in the books that you're examining, quite often come from they often come from marginalized positions with respect to power that might be related to their gender, their sexuality, their race, intersections and combinations of these. And I wondered if you want to talk a bit about how identity and ideology function in your account of the reader in modernism, sort of around this question of the marginalized reader who is adept at not only reading texts and reading society, including but also society's silencing of some kinds of text, some kinds of narratives, etc. Do you want to talk a bit about what these texts have to say about that marginalized subject position?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just at the most very general level, oppressed people are natural hermeneuticists. They have to know. They have to be able to read the signs. Their lives may depend upon it. So it strikes me as not strange, but very interesting that so many of the superior readers in these works turn out to be members of one disenfranchised group or minority uh, uh, that are given the epistemological power. So.
Are there other folks who want to ask some questions about the book? Go ahead, Peter. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't seem to find my raise the hand function. Brian, thank you for the amazing talk. I'm still looking forward to reading the book. And Christina, I want to build on some of your thoughtful questions too. Brian, I've got two big questions for you. First of all, has to do with the landscape of reading. By the way, Conrad has that famous phrase that I know you like, that one writes only half the book, the other half is with the reader. I think you're explaining to me in ways I had not appreciated what that means. But I'm wondering for you, coming out of the experience of this book, I think you've already hinted about how the landscape of Conrad changes. You mentioned the secret share, but then you took us not to Heart of Darkness, but you took us to Outcast of the Islands. I'm wondering how, through your approach, your emphasis on the reader, the landscape of Conrad changes, what texts we might pay more attention to than we have traditionally, how that might apply to modernism as well, what surprise modernist authors that maybe we haven't heard of so much. Are there genres that we should pay more attention to? And then this can go across periods because you just have this capacious understanding of how readers link to one another. So just like landscapes of reading, what books that we haven't heard of before should we be paying attention to? And then I thought that this whole line of conversation about desire was really interesting. You may have kind of already answered this, but I find that one of the great challenges now is in this moment we live in to get people to read it all. Particularly reading like a physical book. Why there's so much distress in the world and there's so much distractions from one's attention. And so cultivating the desire to read is a really big deal. And I'm wondering how that desire to read in the first place figures into your model of the critical reader. To turn one into a critical reader presupposes that you read the book in the first place and became invested. And it seems to be related to what you both were talking about the the desire to read. So landscapes of reading and desire to read. Any thoughts on those?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Uh, okay, so Conrad, just to trace the trajectory of his career concerning this particular issue, uh, does it throughout, for almost 20 years, pretty consistently in a rather similar way, though he varies the subjects. And so in The Secret Agent, you'll have Stevie, who gets terribly upset by reading socialist and anarchist journals and newspapers, uh, and he is the one who ultimately is it carries the bomb to the Greenwich Observatory and is killed on the way. So and then you have the rebels in Nostromo, Pedro Montero, who by reading slightly fictional or partially fictionalized accounts of uh, 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 various historical events in the garret he was living in Paris, gave him the idea to launch the rebellion back in Sulaco. Now, it finally changes. I could give a few other examples, but it's the same basic idea applied in different ways in different contexts, different settings. But when you get to Typhoon, there is a difference. And there, Captain McWhirr is encountering this typhoon. He has no experience of it, and he has no imagination. He cannot imagine the destruction it's going to cause. And so he looks at his book of seamanship, and he doesn't believe it. So he's a different kind of bad reader. Instead of uh, failing to be, instead of failing to read these texts critically, he fails to believe the accurate text. He won't do the surface reading that it requires, uh, and they sail right into the typhoon. So that's his punishment. So, and that's the inverse of that. So again, yeah, you do find some interesting developments with people who, very creative authors who are taking this basic idea and running it through all these different scenarios. Genres that's a really interesting point because You don't find any of this in drama, including dramas written by the same people who wrote these narratives. And I have not found any in poetry either. Not that my knowledge of poetry is at all as extensive. So this is very much writers of narratives commenting on other writers of narratives. So that's interesting. And in fact, we could go further and say that it's largely an Anglo-American phenomenon. You do find a few German authors writing about reading, some very interesting, very prominent ones, but not in the way that I've been tracing here. Starting with Flaubert and ending up with Ian McEwan. And so, as far as books, that this kind of approach makes really visible, I would really want to. One of the wonderful discoveries was Catherine Ann Porter's Old Mortality. I don't think many people know it. It is magnificent. It's brilliant, and it perfectly embodies all of these issues, and in the context of sexual desire and its suppression, and the suppression of women's rights, and the abortion question as well, which is very central to the work, and how that is read. So, and this is something that really engages students as well. When there's an interpretive mystery, and you ask them, so what really happens? And then to give another example, Julian Barnes' The Sense of an Ending is a magnificent work. Again, that my experience. Shannon may be able to bear this out as well. It worked wonderfully in the classroom. And again, it's all about a character trying to interpret the events of his own past and failing, but inviting the reader thereby to connect the dots.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I'm not sure if you called me, but yeah, I have a question. Thank you all for this wonderful talk and such thoughtful moderation and additional questions. So modernism is not my field, so I'm a bit of an interloper here. But I was wondering, sort of two-part question. One is about like the sort of formal characteristics that produce the critical reader, if there are any, and then also sort of the affective registers of what you're discussing here, particularly with desire in the work. And I'm sort of thinking about, you mentioned indeterminacy, and I'm thinking of Lynn Hygenian's work on like the open and closed text, to think if there's any formal manifestations that that lead to a kind of critical response to a text. And then also, if it's more of a question of affect than a question of formal kind of composition, someone like Barth's writing on the pleasure of the text is like, does that produce desire in an affective register to kind of channel the erotics of writing into a work?
Okay. Yeah. So it's one interesting component. You'll find at varying levels a dissonance where the characters interpret events, or the narrator interprets events in a certain way, and the critical reader realizes, there's more to it than that. This is an incomplete interpretation, or in some cases, as in the Barnes example, the narrator himself knows he doesn't understand what's going on. At the very end, he thinks he knows, but he doesn't. So so those are obvious techniques, and also when you come to attempts to provide a closure, Nadine Gordimer is wonderful at not giving you satisfactory endings and forcing the reader to complete the interpretive work, and that Peter Malleus describes, in the quotation from Conrad, that depicts this event so nicely, I think. As far as affect, so much of this is an interpretive and an epistemological issue. So a lot of the affect, the affectual component, would be just the joy of and the feeling that, oh, you've figured it out. So and again, so many of the and when it comes to sexual desire, so many of those actually turn out to be illusory uh, moments that yeah, that's a different kind. It's a deflationary emotion.
There questions? Go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That's so interesting. And I was thinking, because I too was thinking, maybe I'm always sort of thinking about Roland Barthes, but it's like, but I too was thinking about that, and yes, I think, what you're saying is that it is that deflationary moment. At the same time, that's pleasure for the reader in other, there's almost this sort of schadenfreude when the people in the novel are getting it wrong, and we're like, I figured it out. And so I think but I was thinking about picking up this idea of genre that you were talking about. I'm wondering if you consider it all, and maybe not, probably not in the book, but just in your own thinking about the ways that film does some of this work, because there's so many films that are films about looking and watching, and both on the more sort of esoteric level type, arty films, but also it was like the Fablemans. It's all about like, how do you watch and piece together interpretation and misinterpretation.
Oh yeah, that's a great great question, and in fact, you find this drama in all kinds of films. I'm thinking Coppola's The Conversation, where I mean, they have a fragment of a conversation, and people are trying to figure out and think they know the larger implications, the context, and the ultimate meaning. But of course, they get it all wrong, terribly wrong. And in the Dutch film The Vanishing, there too, clues appear, and the man whose wife has vanished is trying to solve, discover the pattern, discover the meaning, understand what happens, and he does in the end. So now, but what you notice, of course, this is about interpretation, sometimes interpretations of words, but not really about reading. So I think that's the book that you should write next.
I'll get right on that.
Shannon, you had a question.
Shannon, did you have one?
I don't think we can hear you, Shannon.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So this isn't like maybe the most fully formed question, but I was thinking while you were, I was thinking while you were talking about this, all the texts involved, which almost all of them we read together in a seminar about a year and a half ago. So I'm fairly familiar with them. That all of them are later texts. At least I think they're like later texts of the authors you're talking about. So I was like wondering if you thought about in the book if this is like a sort of thing happening with like feelings of like authority or like pedagogical authority on the part of the writers, like thinking about Madox Ford, how he saw himself as like a literary shaper of the field through his like work as an editor on reviews and whatnot. So I don't know if that's fully formed, but I mean also like Julian Barnes' sense of the ending, obviously so interested in theory and is one of his like later books.
Very good. Yeah, thanks so much. And now, if I could, reformulate that a little bit, I would suggest, in fact, that there's a more interesting, perhaps, dynamic going on in a lot of these works. So Joyce, from the beginning, the first stories in Dubliners involve reading, and typically, invariably, misreading. And we think of an encounter, the second story in the book, one of the first ones published, about these kids who read these westerns written by an English, pro-imperial author, and they decide to have an adventure themselves, and so they cut school and they run off and they wind up encountering. They have an adventure. They encounter this old pederast who describes himself as a bookworm and starts talking to them about books and then sex, girls, and so forth. So certainly in Joyce's case and in Conrad's case, from the very virtually the very beginning, and also Virginia Woolf, the voyage out is. There are these elaborate discussions of the protagonist reading, and bitter debates over the implication of it. Different scholars Woolf scholars fight over its meaning. But it's also the case that over the course of their career, especially the authors that keep writing on this material, they reach a certain point of summation where they set it all up. And Joyce does that in Ulysses, and the drama of reading in Ulysses, and Woolf especially in To the Lighthouse, where they really bring together all their ideas about reading and misreading and interpretation. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I don't want to absorb all the time, but I want to ask, I want to see if I can fit in one more question. Okay, so I have an unfair question for you, Brian.
Uh-huh.
Lest you thought you would come away unscathed. And I think I want to ask, I didn't intend to ask this question, and it's not one of the questions I sent you yesterday. But I'm interested in asking you this question, one, because I'm so curious about it, but two, because there are a lot of students here. So when we were first setting up this event, I was sick. I had COVID, and Brian was like, okay, if you don't have time to read the whole book, here are the pages and here are all the different things. And then he was, and one of the things, and I did read the whole book, just to be clear, I should get a sticker for that. So you said skip over the reading of Elizabeth Bowen because I'm not happy with that one. And I'm really curious to have you talk, if you're willing, about like what you're satisfied with or dissatisfied with in your own reading in that account and how it fit with the project and so forth. Because I just feel like it's so interesting for everyone to hear, but I also just think it's really interesting and useful for students to I don't know, think about like parts and wholes and things that work more and less successfully and stuff like that. So would you mind talking a little bit about your Bowen reading?
Sure. Yeah, and again, yeah, let me contextualize it. Yeah, so it seems when you write a book that has a number of different sections, they don't all turn out equally well. Some turn out much better, and others less perfect. And so the Bowen it's very interesting, and it's very there were sections that I did cut it and didn't publish. And that one I left him. It's not as compelling as many of the others, and maybe it is precisely because it's so late in this tradition, and she would have been very familiar with all the earlier works. Um, so yeah, I mean, she does talk about reading, and she says some very interesting things, and there's some very intriguing comments about the woman who becomes a librarian and then despises the people who come in to read books, and they rather admire her for despising them. And this is a twist. This is a different aspect. And then the other thing, it's also a lot about life writing and how people are represented. And of course, nobody likes the way they're represented, and they break into her journal and read it and try to warn her about it. And of course, they don't like what is being said about them, both because sometimes it's true, and other times they feel it's imperfectly contextualized, so they look bad even though they look worse than they actually are, which is still pretty bad. So yeah, I didn't feel that one came together quite as much as some of the others, where I'm really happy with some of the work in there that I think is really contributes to the understanding of some of these major texts. And so yeah, I mean, five or six people have written about reading into the Lighthouse, because they're always reading. Everybody's reading, or they pretend to read, or they talk about reading. They say they're going to read. They wish they had read certain things. But I'm very happy the way I was able to write that one up, and I'm quite pleased with my chapter on Ulysses. And that was I really wanted to publish that as an article, but I was just so afraid that you can only publish so much, and before they won't let you publish the book because it's already in print. And that was, if I could have done things differently, I would have sent that out as an article too. So, and again, at least a dozen people have written about reading and acts of reading in Ulysses, but no one has. I mean, no one that I encountered is able to tie it all together. So yeah, I'm very happy about that.
Since Lillian, in the midst of retirement, where she
Yes.
should be doing fun things, has instead come to your book launch today, in part to hear about Ulysses. Do you want to say a little bit more, especially because it seems like you're signaling like this is something that I was really happy with. This came together. Do you want to kind of give us a synopsis of the argument that you're offering about Ulysses in that chapter?
Yeah. Well, again, there are so many misreadings that are demystified by Joyce. It's a very realistic book, and very anti-idealistic at every level, anti-imperial, anti-theological, and so on. And throughout Joyce's career, he likes to take typical romantic narratives and explode them. Especially narratives about romantic uh, uh, couples that have a wonderful time. It's a very different scenario that we get in Ulysses. Penelope, has a lover that day. So, and one interesting thing is, yes, he exfoliates all these misreadings, including the Orientalism that the character of Araby is subject to, and so many of the others in the short story Araby, who's intoxicated by this Eastern enchantment in the name Araby. And Bloom, in the very beginning, imagines being in what we call the Middle East, and he starts imagining walking there, and then suddenly stops himself, says, probably not like that at all. This is something you read in a book. And so he is in this instance exactly the kind of critical reader that Joyce and other modernists are encouraging us to be. So does Stephen Dedalus when he throughout the book, but especially when he's encountering privately often DC's imperialistic and sexist and Christian notion of history and the progress of history. So and of course Molly also, though not much of a reader, nevertheless is very good at demystifying things as well.
Well, I think that we have gotten to the end of things. So I want to congratulate you again, Brian. You need to stop publishing books because I think this is like the third one of these that I've had to do, and it's really just putting like a kink in my schedule. Um,
I'll
but
definitely slow down.
okay. Thank you very much for a really interesting book and some really thoughtful responses. Anyway, thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks everybody for being here.